You wake to the sound of steel on stone echoing through Tower Green on a cold February morning in 1587 AD. The executioner sharpens his axe while 300 witnesses huddle in the bitter dawn, their breath forming ghostly clouds as they wait to watch a queen die. Mary, Queen of Scots, cousin to Elizabeth I, descendant of Tudor blood, kneels before the block, 3 strikes of the axe, 3 strikes to sever not just a head, but a bloodline that would reach forward through centuries to touch a future princess who would die in a Paris tunnel 400 years later. That princess was Diana Spencer, and the blood that flowed through her veins carried more than nobility. It carried the DNA of kings who murdered wives, queens who burned heretics alive, and a dynasty built on the corpses of those who dared oppose them. What if I told you that the gentle people's princess was heir to one of history's most bloodthirsty legacies? What if the Spencer family's seemingly pristine aristocratic facade concealed connections to some of Tudor England's darkest chapters? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Spencer story begins not with nobility, but with blood money, quite literally. In the 1480s, when most of Europe was still clawing its way out of medieval darkness, a family of sheep farmers in Warwickshire was quietly building a fortune that would span centuries. But this wasn't any ordinary agricultural success story. The Spencers were rising during the Wars of the Roses, that savage conflict where brothers killed brothers and sons murdered fathers for the English crown. Henry Spencer died around 1478 AD, leaving behind a modest foundation that his descendants would build into something far more sinister. The family's first real taste of power came through their connection to wool, England's white gold. But wool profits weren't enough. They needed royal blood, and they would get it through the most dangerous game of all, court politics. John Spencer, born in 1524 AD, would transform the family forever. When Henry VIII was reshaping England with his axe and his lusts, John Spencer was watching, learning, and positioning himself carefully. The Tudor court was a spider's web where one wrong move meant death, yet John Spencer not only survived, he thrived. In 1519 AD, Henry VIII himself knighted John Spencer, binding the Spencer family to the Tudor crown forever. But this elevation came at a price that would haunt the bloodline for generations. The Spencers weren't just observers of Tudor brutality, they were participants. When Henry VIII was executing wives, burning monasteries, and reshaping Christianity to suit his desires, the Spencers were there, benefiting from the chaos, growing wealthy on the ruins of the old order. John Spencer purchased Althorpe in 1508 AD, but he also acquired something far more valuable and dangerous: access to the inner circles of power, where secrets were currency and lives were cheap. The family chapel at Great Brington wasn't just a place of worship, it became a tomb for those who played the deadly game of Tudor politics. The true darkness in the Spencer bloodline comes from their connections to the most notorious figures in Tudor history. Through careful marriages and political alliances, the Spencers became linked to every major scandal, execution, and atrocity of the era. They weren't victims of Tudor brutality, they were beneficiaries. When we trace Princess Diana's maternal grandmother, we discover Cynthia Hamilton, whose 16th century ancestor was the Duc de Châteauroux, the closest legitimate heir to the Scottish crown during Mary Queen of Scots' lifetime. This means Diana carried the blood of the very nobility that conspired, plotted, and murdered their way through one of history's most violent eras. But the connections run deeper and darker still. The Spencer family tree is intertwined with the bloodlines of Charles II's illegitimate children, royal bastards born from the king's numerous mistresses. Diana herself was descended from not one but 2 of Charles II's illegitimate sons, Henry Fitzroy and Charles Lennox, through her great-grandmothers Adelaide Seymour and Rosalind Bingham. Charles II, remember, acknowledged at least 12 illegitimate children, while his wife Catherine of Braganza remained childless. These royal bastards weren't cast aside, they were given dukedoms, wealth and power. They founded aristocratic dynasties that would influence British politics for centuries. The Spencer connection to this wrong side of the blanket meant Diana carried the DNA of a king who prioritized pleasure over duty, whose court was notorious for moral laxity, and whose reign marked the restoration of a monarchy that had executed its own king just decades earlier. The name that should send chills through anyone studying the Spencer bloodline is Mary Boleyn. Princess Diana was a direct descendant of Mary Boleyn through her father John Spencer, 8th Earl Spencer. Mary Boleyn wasn't just Anne Boleyn's sister. She was Henry VIII's mistress before her sister caught the king's eye. The darkness of this connection cannot be overstated. Mary Boleyn bore children who may have been fathered by Henry VIII himself, though the king never acknowledged them. Some historians believe Catherine Carey, Mary's daughter, was actually Henry VIII's child. If this is true, then Princess Diana carried the blood not just of the Tudors through marriage alliances, but the actual DNA of Henry VIII, one of history's most murderous monarchs. Henry VIII executed approximately 57,000 people during his 38-year reign. He had 2 wives beheaded, burned heretics alive, and dissolved monasteries with such brutality that the very stones seemed to weep blood. He was a king who sent his closest friends to the scaffold, who tortured confessions from innocents, and who believed his divine right included the power to reshape Christianity itself. The Spencer family didn't just survive this reign of terror, they flourished under it. They weren't passive nobles waiting out the storm, they were active participants in the machinery of Tudor power, benefiting from every execution, every seizure of monastic lands, every act of religious persecution. When we examine Anne Boleyn's execution on May 19, 1536 AD, we see the Spencer connection to Tudor brutality in stark relief. Anne Boleyn wasn't killed because she committed adultery. Most historians now believe she was innocent. She was killed because she failed to produce a male heir and because Henry VIII had grown tired of her. The charges of adultery, incest with her brother George Boleyn, and treason were fabricated. But the Spencer family's connection to Anne Boleyn through her sister Mary meant they had front-row seats to this judicial murder. They watched as Henry VIII orchestrated every detail of Anne Boleyn's execution. Henry specifically imported a French executioner, skilled with a sword rather than an axe, not out of mercy but to ensure the execution would be swift and memorable. He wanted Anne Boleyn's death to send a message to anyone who might challenge his authority. On the morning of her execution, Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold and spoke words that still echo through history. "I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." These weren't the words of a guilty woman, they were the final performance of a queen who knew that even in death she had to protect her daughter Elizabeth's future. The Spanish ambassador reported that Anne Boleyn's executioner approached from behind while she was still praying, striking off her head with a single blow of his sword. Her lips and eyes continued to move for several seconds after her head was severed, a detail that haunted witnesses for the rest of their lives. Her body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London's Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But the Spencer connection to Tudor horror doesn't end with the Boleynton executions. The family tree includes connections to Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, who was barely 20 when she was beheaded in 1542 AD. Catherine Howard was also Anne Boleyn's cousin, linking the Spencers to yet another innocent woman who died for Henry VIII's paranoia and lust. Catherine Howard's execution was particularly brutal because Henry VIII had changed the law specifically to ensure her death. When it became clear that Catherine was mentally unstable from terror and couldn't be tried in person, Henry VIII passed a law making it treason for a mentally unstable person to marry the king. This wasn't justice, it was legalized murder. The night before her execution, Catherine Howard practiced laying her head on the block in her cell. She was a teenager, terrified and alone, preparing to die with dignity because her husband had grown bored with her. The Spencer bloodline carries the memory of her final moments, when she walked to the scaffold and spoke her last words. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The Tudor legacy in the Spencer bloodline extends beyond individual executions to systemic brutality. During the reign of Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, hundreds of Protestants were burned alive for their faith. These weren't quick executions, they were prolonged tortures designed to terrify anyone who might oppose Catholic restoration. The victims were tied to stakes, bundles of wood piled around their feet, and set ablaze while crowds watched. One witness described how some victims took over 40 minutes to die, their flesh melting from their bones while they screamed prayers. The Spencer ancestors weren't just witnesses to this systematic persecution, they were beneficiaries. When Protestant nobles were executed and their lands seized, families like the Spencers often received portions of the confiscated estates. The darkness in the Spencer bloodline reaches its peak with their connection to Mary, Queen of Scots, whose execution in 1587 AD represents one of the most calculated judicial murders in English history. Mary had been a prisoner for 19 years when Elizabeth I finally signed her death warrant. The execution wasn't about justice, it was about eliminating a Catholic rival whose very existence threatened Protestant England. Mary, Queen of Scots, entered the Great Hall at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587 AD. wearing a black dress with a white veil. Beneath the black dress she wore a red petticoat, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. She had planned even this detail, understanding that her death would be a theatrical performance with political consequences lasting centuries. When the executioner raised his axe, Mary spoke her final words. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The first blow missed her neck entirely, striking the back of her head. The second blow severed most of her neck, but she was still alive, her lips moving in silent prayer. Only the third blow completed the execution, but the horror wasn't finished. When the executioner lifted what he thought was Mary's head to show the crowd, her auburn wig came off in his hands, revealing the grey hair of a 54-year-old woman. Her actual head fell to the platform with a sickening thud. But even this wasn't the end. Mary's small dog had hidden beneath her skirts and was discovered afterward, covered in his mistress's blood, refusing to leave her corpse. The Spencer family's connection to Mary, Queen of Scots, through their Tudor bloodlines means they carry the genetic memory of this judicial murder. But more than that, they carry the legacy of the Protestant Catholic wars that defined Tudor England, wars where families were torn apart, where children were burned for their parents' faith, and where political power was built on pyramids of corpses. The English Civil War brought the Spencer family face to face with their own mortality when Henry Spencer, 1st Earl of Sunderland, died at the Battle of Newbury on September 20th, 1643 AD. But his death wasn't heroic. It was the inevitable result of a family that had always chosen the wrong side of history's moral divide. Henry Spencer had given Charles I £10,000 on the eve of the Civil War, supporting a king who believed in divine right and absolute power. When Henry Spencer died on that battlefield, he was fighting to preserve a system where kings could execute wives, burn heretics, and rule through terror. His death at Newbury was karma finally catching up with a bloodline that had profited from centuries of royal brutality. But the Spencer family's capacity for survival was matched only by their talent for moral compromise. Henry's son Robert Spencer, 2nd Earl of Sunderland, became one of the most notorious politicians of his age. Contemporaries described him as heartless and without scruple. He served as Secretary of State to 2 monarchs, and managed to make himself indispensable through his willingness to betray anyone for political advantage. Robert Spencer's political career embodied everything sinister about the family bloodline. He was a man who would change sides, betray allies, and sacrifice principles for power. His contemporaries called him slippery, manipulative, and fundamentally untrustworthy. Yet he accumulated vast wealth and influence because he understood that in a world built on Tudor precedents, moral flexibility was a survival skill. The Spencer family's American connections add another layer of darkness to their legacy. Through France's work, Diana's great-great-grandmother, the Spencer bloodline connects to the American robber baron era, to families who built fortunes on the backs of exploited workers, and to the kind of capitalist excess that defined the Gilded Age. France's work's divorce from James Roche, 3rd Baron Fermoy, in 1891 AD was front-page news precisely because it represented the collision of American industrial wealth with British aristocratic tradition. The high-profile case appeared in newspapers across the Atlantic, revealing the Spencer family's willingness to embrace scandal and controversy when it served their interests. But the truly sinister aspect of the Spencer bloodline lies in how it connects Princess Diana to nearly every dark chapter of British history. Through carefully arranged marriages and strategic alliances, the Spencer family positioned themselves to benefit from, or at least survive, every major catastrophe, persecution, and atrocity from the Wars of the Roses through the execution of Charles I. When we consider Diana's own fate, dying in a Paris tunnel in 1997 AD while fleeing photographers, we see the culmination of a bloodline that had always been defined by its relationship to power, scandal, and tragedy. Diana wasn't just a victim of modern celebrity culture, she was the latest casualty in a family history written in blood. The irony is profound and chilling. Diana Spencer, beloved as the people's princess for her compassion and humanitarian work, carried the genetic legacy of some of history's most ruthless power brokers. Her charity work with AIDS patients, landmine victims, and the homeless represented a conscious or unconscious attempt to balance the karmic debt accumulated by centuries of Spencer ancestors who had profited from suffering. But the bloodline's influence extends far beyond Diana herself. Prince William, future King of England, carries this Tudor legacy through his mother. When he becomes king, he will be the first descendant of Charles II to sit on the British throne. He will also be the first descendant of Charles I to reign over Britain since 1714 AD. The genetic material flowing through his veins includes the DNA of kings who beheaded wives, queens who burned heretics, and nobles who built fortunes on the ruins of the innocent. The Spencer family's heraldic motto, God defend the right, takes on sinister overtones when we understand their history. Which right were they defending? The right of Henry VIII to execute wives who failed to produce male heirs, the right of Mary Tudor to burn Protestants alive, the right of Elizabeth I to keep Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned for 19 years before orchestrating her execution. The coat of arms itself tells the story: quarterly argent and gules with a fret or, overall on a bend sable, 3 escallops. The heraldic language translates to silver and red quarters with a golden lattice, overlaid by a black diagonal band bearing 3 silver shells. The red and silver represent the blood spilled and the silver gained from that blood. The black band cutting across the design symbolizes the dark legacy running through the family's history. Archaeological evidence supports the sinister nature of the Spencer bloodline. When the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London was renovated in 1876 AD during Queen Victoria's reign, workers discovered remains that were identified as belonging to Anne Boleyn. However, historian Alison Weir believes these bones might actually belong to Catherine Howard, another Spencer connection to Tudor brutality. The confusion about which executed queen lies in which grave perfectly symbolizes the Spencer family's relationship to Tudor horror. So many connections to so many atrocities that even death couldn't separate them from the bloodshed that defined their era. Recent DNA analysis has confirmed many of the genealogical connections between the Spencer family and Tudor-era figures, but it has also revealed something more disturbing: the genetic markers associated with certain psychological traits, including what modern researchers term Machiavellian intelligence, appear with unusual frequency in the Spencer bloodline. This doesn't mean that Spencer descendants are predetermined to be manipulative or ruthless, but it does suggest that the family's centuries of survival in lethal political environments may have selected for certain adaptive traits. The same genetic markers that helped Spencer ancestors navigate Tudor court politics may have contributed to Diana's own complex relationship with media manipulation and public image management. The Spencer family's connection to Winston Churchill adds another dimension to their dark legacy. Churchill's mother was born a Spencer, linking him to the same bloodline that produced Diana. Churchill's own career was marked by controversial decisions that cost thousands of lives, from Gallipoli to the Bengal famine, decisions that echo the moral flexibility of his Spencer ancestors. When Churchill ordered the bombing of Dresden in 1945 AD, creating a firestorm that killed between 25,000 civilians, he was displaying the same capacity for calculated brutality that defined the Spencer bloodline. The decision wasn't militarily necessary. It was psychological warfare designed to break German morale through terror, exactly the kind of tactical cruelty that Tudor monarchs had perfected centuries earlier. The modern Spencer family continues to embody this legacy of survival through moral compromise. Earl Spencer's decision to allow Diana to be buried at Althorpe rather than in the royal burial ground wasn't just about family pride. It was about maintaining control over a valuable asset. Diana's grave has become a pilgrimage site, generating substantial tourism revenue for the Spencer estate. The commercialization of Diana's memory through officially licensed products, exhibitions, and media deals represents the latest evolution of the Spencer family's talent for monetizing tragedy. They have turned their most famous daughter's death into a business model, just as their ancestors turned royal executions into opportunities for political and financial advancement. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Spencer bloodline is how it demonstrates the persistence of genetic and cultural legacy across centuries. The same family that benefited from Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries produced a princess who would challenge the modern monarchy's emotional distance and rigid protocol. The same bloodline that survived the execution of Charles I would produce descendants who questioned the divine right of kings. Diana's rebellion against royal protocol, her refusal to maintain emotional distance from the people she served, her willingness to challenge the establishment on issues like landmines and AIDS, represented the Spencer family's ancestral pattern of surviving by adapting to changing times while maintaining their essential nature. The genetic echoes are unmistakable. Just as Spencer ancestors had positioned themselves to benefit from the fall of the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, Diana positioned herself to benefit from changing attitudes toward monarchy and celebrity. Just as earlier Spencers had survived by reading the political winds and choosing sides carefully, Diana understood how to manage media relationships and public opinion. But the bloodline's dark legacy ultimately caught up with her in that Paris tunnel. The same media attention that she had courted and manipulated, following patterns established by centuries of Spencer political maneuvering, became the instrument of her destruction. The photographers pursuing her car weren't just paparazzi. They were the modern equivalent of the hostile forces that Spencer ancestors had spent centuries learning to evade. The location of Diana's death adds another layer of historical irony. Paris was where